Andrew Carter sat in his corner office, high above the bustling streets of Boston, staring at the sleek divorce papers resting on his desk. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was stunning, the city bathed in the warm glow of late afternoon, but he barely noticed. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build his real estate empire, expanding his company's reach into some of the most coveted neighborhoods. Success had come at a cost, though, and today, that cost had arrived in the form of a neatly stacked set of legal documents. For nearly a decade, Andrew had been married to Emily, a talented interior designer with a sharp eye for detail and a heart full of warmth. In the beginning, their relationship had been filled with late-night conversations, spontaneous road trips along the New England coast, and shared dreams of a future built together. But somewhere along the way, Andrew had buried himself in work, prioritizing profit margins over date nights, investor meetings over anniversary dinners. He had convinced himself that providing financial security was enough, that love could survive on good intentions and material comfort. Emily had tried to reach him, he knew that now. She had waited up for him on countless nights, her cup of tea growing cold as she sat alone at the kitchen table. She had decorated their home with care, making sure each room felt warm and inviting, even when he barely noticed. She had once told him, "You plan 5, 10 years into the future, but you never stop to enjoy the life we have now." At the time, he had brushed off her concerns, thinking she simply didn't understand the pressure he was under. But now, staring at the signature line on the divorce papers, he realized she had understood all too well. The previous months had been filled with silence. They lived in the same apartment, but it felt more like coexisting than marriage. Conversations were reduced to logistics, groceries, bills, scheduling, and the warmth that had once defined their relationship had faded into a polite but distant formality. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his lawyer, reminding him of their upcoming court date to finalize the divorce. He sighed, rubbing his temples. It was all set in motion, a legal process that would soon separate them completely. Then, his assistant, Nicole, knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Carter, your wife called earlier." "She didn't leave a message." Andrew hesitated, reading the note she handed him. Emily rarely called anymore. For a brief moment, he considered calling her back, but instead, he slipped the note into his pocket. Whatever she had wanted to say, it was probably too late. As he left his office for the day, a strange feeling settled over him. He had spent years chasing success, but for the first time, he wondered if he had sacrificed the wrong things in the process. His perfectly planned future suddenly felt emptier than ever. Andrew Carter stepped into the apartment he once called home, setting his keys on the kitchen counter with a quiet sigh. The space felt different now, emptier, colder. It wasn't just because some of Emily's belongings were already packed away, leaving small gaps on the bookshelves and the walls bare where framed photos once hung. It was the silence, the kind that reminded him how far apart they had drifted. Across the living room, Emily stood with her arms crossed loosely, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her face. She looked tired, not just physically but emotionally, as if carrying the weight of all the years they had spent growing apart. "I tried calling you earlier," she said, her voice measured. "I was in meetings," Andrew replied, knowing how hollow that excuse sounded. He had always been in meetings. "What's going on?" She gestured toward the couch, where a single lamp cast a warm circle of light. "I have a request," she said. "Before we sign the papers, before everything is final, I'd like us to spend one last night together. Here. In this apartment." Andrew's brow furrowed. "One last night?" She inhaled, as if carefully choosing her words. "Not for reconciliation. I know that's not where we are. But this place, it meant something once. We meant something once. And I don't want our last memory to be a cold, impersonal goodbye in a lawyer's office. Just for a few hours, let's be us again. His first instinct was to question her motives. His mind, trained to detect hidden agendas in high-stakes business deals, warned him this might be some kind of emotional trap. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, he saw no trace of manipulation, only quiet resolve. "What do you expect to come from this?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "Nothing, Andrew. No grand realizations, no last-minute changes of heart. Just a proper farewell." A long silence followed. Once, he would have known exactly what to say to her, how to tease out a smile or ease the tension. Now, every word felt heavy, every breath too loud in the stillness of the apartment. Finally, he nodded. "All right. If that's what you want, I'll stay." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 2 mugs of tea, handing one to him. He accepted it, the warmth seeping into his fingers. They sat together on the couch, sipping in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. After a while, he asked, "Why do you need this?" Emily set her mug down and met his gaze. "Because I need to remember what we had. And you do too, even if you won't admit it." Andrew didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if he could. But as he looked around the apartment, at the space where they had built a life together, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he wasn't certain he wanted to let go. Andrew Carter stirred as the first rays of morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the apartment. The silence felt different, not the cold, empty kind he had grown used to, but something more delicate, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He turned over, expecting to find Emily still beside him, but the space next to him was empty. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the emotions from the night before. It had been bittersweet. They had talked, reminisced, even laughed at old memories that felt like they belonged to a different life. But nothing had changed, this was still the end. Or so he thought. A faint sound drifted from down the hall, a quiet murmur of voices. Frowning, Andrew sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He reached for his dress shirt from the night before and shrugged it on before following the sound toward Emily's old office. The door was slightly ajar. As he pushed it open, he was met with a sight that made his breath hitch. Emily was sitting at her desk, her laptop open, the screen displaying a grainy, black and white image that was unmistakable, a sonogram. A doctor's face filled part of the screen, speaking in calm, measured tones. Andrew's pulse pounded. The rhythmic sound of a medical monitor hummed softly through the speakers. It took him a moment to understand, to fully grasp what he was seeing and hearing. "We're looking at around 16 weeks, the doctor was saying. "Everything appears healthy, though we'll continue monitoring closely." Emily must have sensed him there because she turned, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of what was unspoken thick between them. His voice, when he finally found it, was hoarse. "Emily, what is this?" She swallowed, closing the laptop slowly as if gathering herself. "I'm pregnant, Andrew." The words landed like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of the reality that had just shattered everything he thought he knew. Pregnant. After years of trying, of doctor visits filled with quiet disappointments, of accepting that it simply wasn't in their future, how was this even possible? His mouth opened, but no words came. The weight of emotion pressing against his chest was almost unbearable. "I found out a few days ago," Emily continued, her voice quiet. I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't want this to change your decision out of obligation. I wasn't going to use it as a reason to stop the divorce." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space. His heart thundered in his chest. "Emily, this changes everything." She exhaled, shaking her head. "It doesn't have to." But it did. And as Andrew stood there, staring at the sonogram, at the undeniable proof of a life he never thought they would have, he realized that the future he had been so sure of had just been rewritten in an instant. Andrew Carter sat in the executive boardroom of Carter Development Group, his company's name etched in bold letters on the glass wall behind him. He had spent years building this empire, late nights, endless meetings, negotiations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Every decision had been about expansion, about securing the next big deal. Now, for the first time, he was questioning everything. Across the polished mahogany table, Charles Reynolds, one of his company's largest investors, leaned back in his chair, his expression one of barely concealed impatience. "Andrew," he said, folding his hands, "I've been hearing some concerning rumors. You're reconsidering the demolition project in South Boston?" Andrew straightened in his seat. "That's correct," he said evenly. "We're looking into a phased redevelopment instead. Preserving as much of the community as possible while modernizing the infrastructure." Reynolds scoffed. "You mean dragging this process out for years instead of executing a clean demolition and rebuild? That's not what we agreed on." The tension in the room was palpable. Andrew glanced around at the other board members, many of whom were waiting to see how he would respond. Just months ago, he would have been aligned with Reynolds, valuing efficiency and profit above all else. But things had changed. He had changed. Sitting in that same chair just a few weeks ago, he had been prepared to push this project through without hesitation. But then Emily had told him she was pregnant. In an instant, everything he thought he understood about priorities had shifted. The thought of creating a future for his child, a future built on tearing people from their homes, made his stomach turn. "The numbers still make sense," Andrew continued, keeping his voice steady. "With a phased approach, we reduce legal risks and public backlash. We secure city incentives for historic preservation. It's a longer play, but it's the right one." Reynolds shook his head, laughing dryly. "Listen to yourself. You sound like a community activist, not a businessman. People move, Andrew. It's part of development. You think those families are going to thank you for delaying the inevitable? No. They'll resent you for giving them false hope." Andrew clenched his jaw. "They deserve a chance to stay in the homes they've built their lives in." Reynolds' expression darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game. The board backed you because they believed you had the spine to make tough decisions. If you start pandering to public sentiment, you won't just lose this project, you'll lose their confidence." A silence stretched between them. Andrew knew what Reynolds was implying. A leadership shakeup. If he pushed too hard against the board's interests, they would find a way to push him out. He had built this company from the ground up, but that didn't mean he was untouchable. For years, he had prided himself on being ruthless when necessary. He had seen friends and competitors hesitate in moments like these, questioning whether the pursuit of success justified the means. He had never understood their weakness until now. Because now, he had something to lose. Not his company, not his reputation, but the chance to be the kind of man his child could look up to. The kind of man Emily had once believed he could be. He leaned forward, meeting Reynolds' gaze head-on. "I understand your concerns, Charles. And I know this isn't the easy path. But I'm not backing down. This company is going to do the right thing. If that's a problem for you, we'll have to find a solution that works for both of us. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. 3 days, he said coldly. I want a revised financial plan proving this won't tank our bottom line. Otherwise, expect resistance. With that, he pushed back his chair and left the room. Andrew exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. The battle was just beginning. He had spent years fighting for wealth and power. Now, for the first time, he was fighting for something more. Andrew Carter stood on the cracked sidewalk of South Boston, surveying the rows of aging brownstones that had become the center of his latest battle. Just weeks ago, this project had been nothing more than another investment opportunity, another chance to expand his company's portfolio and solidify his reputation as a sharp, decisive businessman. But now, as he watched a group of children playing near the worn-down stoop of a 3-story brick building, he saw something else. A community. People who had lived here for decades, raising families, building friendships, carving out lives in a city that often felt unforgiving. It wasn't just about property values or profit margins anymore. It was about them. Beside him, Thomas Baker, a longtime friend and now an unexpected ally, studied the architectural plans laid out on a makeshift table. We're looking at retrofitting the interiors, Thomas said, pointing to one of the sketches. Keeping the historical facades intact while updating the plumbing, wiring, and insulation. It'll take longer than a full teardown, but it'll keep people in their homes. Andrew nodded, taking in the details. And the cost? Higher up front, Thomas admitted, but over time, the long-term investment outweighs it. Plus, city incentives for historic preservation could help balance the books. Andrew exhaled, knowing full well how the board would react. Reynolds and the other investors wanted a fast turnaround. They wanted high-rise condos, luxury developments, and a quick return on investment. What they didn't want was patience, careful planning, or community input. But Andrew no longer cared what they wanted. He had spent years thinking in 5-year projections, making decisions based on quarterly earnings rather than human consequences. But something had shifted in him. Maybe it was Emily's pregnancy, the knowledge that he was about to bring a child into the world and had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. Maybe it was the quiet moments with her in their apartment, where he saw the woman he had once loved still standing there, waiting to see if he could become the person she had once believed in. Let's set up a meeting with the tenants, Andrew said, rolling up his sleeves. I want to hear their concerns firsthand. Thomas gave him a curious glance. You sure about that? These folks don't exactly trust developers. They've been burned before. Andrew met his gaze with quiet determination. Then I'll prove I'm different. Later that evening, back at his apartment, Emily sat across from him at the kitchen table, flipping through a few design sketches. She had been hesitant at first, wary of getting involved in a project tied so closely to the man she had nearly divorced. But slowly, she had started offering insights, her expertise as an interior designer proving invaluable. This layout, she said, tapping one of the pages, keeps the larger units on the ground floor for elderly residents. That way, they don't have to worry about climbing stairs. Andrew studied the plans. That's smart. I'll bring it up in the next meeting. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. You know, I've been watching you these past few weeks. You're different. He set the plans down and looked at her. I'm trying, he admitted. For the project, for the people who live there, and for you. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes. She wasn't ready to trust him completely yet, he knew that. But the fact that she was still here, still willing to sit at this table with him, meant something. As the night stretched on, Andrew felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. Not just the kind that came with closing deals and winning negotiations, but the kind that came with doing the right thing. It wasn't easy. Change never was. But for the first time in a long time, he was willing to fight for something more than just success. He was willing to fight for redemption. The apartment was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Andrew Carter sat at the kitchen table, watching Emily as she carefully sliced an apple, her movements slow and methodical. It was a small, simple act, but it reminded him of the way she used to prepare fruit for him in the mornings, before work had taken over, before their marriage had started unraveling. They weren't back to what they once were. Not yet. But they were something. And that was more than he had dared to hope for just a few months ago. Emily placed the apple slices onto a small plate and set it in front of him. "Eat," she said, sitting across from him with her own cup of tea. He smirked slightly. "Since when did you start bossing me around?" She raised an eyebrow. "Since I became the one growing a human." A chuckle escaped him before he could stop it. It was the kind of easy, familiar moment that had been missing for far too long. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully, then set the slice down. "I appreciate you letting me be part of this," he said, nodding toward her growing belly. Emily exhaled, running a hand gently over her stomach. "I know you mean that," she said. "But Andrew, I need to be honest with you." He straightened, bracing himself. "I don't know if I can just forget everything that happened between us," she admitted. "I spent years feeling like I was waiting for you to notice me. And when I finally stopped waiting, I didn't think there was anything left to save." His chest tightened. He had been prepared for this conversation, but hearing the words out loud still hurt. "I don't expect you to forget," he said quietly. "I don't even expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm here. I'm not walking away this time." Emily studied him, searching his face for something: truth, sincerity, maybe proof that this version of him was real and not just temporary. "You've changed," she said finally. "I'm trying," he admitted. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. Andrew frowned, standing to answer it. When he opened the door, he was surprised to find his mother, Margaret, standing there, a warm but cautious smile on her face. "Mom," he said, stepping aside. "I wasn't expecting you." "Well," she said, stepping inside and removing her coat, "when my only son tells me he's about to become a father, I think that warrants an unannounced visit." Emily stood, offering Margaret a genuine smile. "It's good to see you." Margaret's eyes flicked between the two of them, taking in the tension, the uncertainty, but also the warmth that hadn't been there the last time she had visited. She placed a gentle hand on Emily's arm. "And how are you feeling, sweetheart?" Emily sighed. "Tired. But mostly okay." Margaret turned to Andrew, her expression shifting slightly. "And you?" He hesitated before answering. "I'm figuring it out." His mother studied him the way only a mother could, seeing through his words, reading between the lines. Then she smiled knowingly. "Good. Keep figuring it out." For the next hour, they sat in the living room, talking about the baby, the future, and even laughing at old memories. It felt normal. It felt like a family. When Margaret finally left, Andrew walked her to the door. She turned to him before stepping out, her expression softer than it had been in years. "I'm proud of you, Andrew," she said. "Not just for the business or the project, but for this. For trying to be the man your family needs." He swallowed hard, nodding. As he closed the door, he turned back to Emily, who was watching him with something unreadable in her eyes. Maybe it wasn't love, not yet. But it was something. Maybe, just maybe, they were finding their way back to each other. The hospital room was dimly lit, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors the only sound cutting through the hushed atmosphere. Andrew Carter sat beside Emily's hospital bed, gripping her hand as she breathed through another contraction. He had never seen her like this, so strong, yet so vulnerable at the same time. "You're doing great," he murmured, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. Emily let out a shaky breath, squeezing his hand with a force he hadn't known she possessed. She paused, panting, "say that one more time, and I swear I will make you regret it." Despite the tension in the room, the nurse chuckled. "Classic labor talk," she said with a wink. "She's almost there." Almost. Andrew had spent the past 9 months preparing for this moment, reading books, attending doctor's appointments, making sure their home was ready. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sheer magnitude of this experience. The fear, the excitement, the overwhelming realization that his life was about to change forever. Margaret, his mother, had flown in from Florida days earlier, staying in the waiting room, giving him space but making it clear she wasn't going anywhere. Even Thomas, his longtime friend and now an ally in both business and life, had sent a text of encouragement. But in this moment, it was just him and Emily. The woman he had almost lost. The woman who had once told him she didn't think they had a future. And yet, here they were, bringing new life into the world together. "Okay, Emily," the doctor's voice was calm but firm. "One more big push." Emily gritted her teeth, bearing down with all the strength she had left. Andrew felt his heart pounding in his chest as he held onto her, whispering whatever words of encouragement he could find. And then, a cry. A loud, piercing, miraculous cry filled the room, followed by the doctor's voice. "You have a daughter." Andrew felt his entire body go still. A daughter. The nurse quickly wrapped the tiny, wriggling baby in a soft hospital blanket before placing her in Emily's arms. The moment Andrew saw her, his breath caught. She was so small, barely more than a bundle, her face scrunched up in protest against the bright lights of the delivery room. Emily let out a soft, exhausted laugh, tears slipping down her cheeks as she cradled their newborn daughter. "Sophie," she whispered. Andrew swallowed hard. He had spent years making million-dollar deals, negotiating contracts, standing firm against some of the toughest people in the industry. And yet, at this moment, as he looked at his daughter for the first time, he felt completely undone. With a trembling hand, he reached out, his fingers brushing against Sophie's impossibly tiny ones. She responded by wrapping her fingers around his pinky, holding on with a strength that took his breath away. "Oh," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "She's perfect." Emily looked up at him, her tired eyes searching his face. "You ready for this?" He let out a shaky laugh. "No," he admitted honestly. "But I want to be." Emily smiled softly, nodding as if she had expected that answer. "That's enough for now." For a long while, they simply sat there, staring at their daughter, marveling at this little miracle they had never thought possible. The outside world faded, the struggles, the past, even the uncertainty of the future. All that mattered was here, in this room, in the warm weight of Sophie in Emily's arms, in the way her tiny fingers clung to Andrew's. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Carter felt like he had truly found his purpose. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the apartment, casting a soft glow over the quiet living room. Andrew Carter sat on the couch, a warm mug of coffee in his hands, but his eyes weren't on the steaming cup. Instead, They were fixed on the tiny bundle asleep in the bassinet beside him. Sophie. Just a few days old, she had already turned his world upside down. Her every breath, every tiny movement, felt like a miracle. The weight of responsibility was immense, but for the first time in his life, he welcomed it. From the hallway, Emily appeared, rubbing her eyes as she pulled her robe tighter around herself. She gave him a tired smile as she made her way over, settling beside him on the couch. "You're up early," she murmured. "So are you," he replied, smirking. She sighed, leaning her head back. "I don't think sleep is going to be a thing for a while." He chuckled softly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "I don't mind," he said. "I want to be here for it all." Emily turned to study him, something thoughtful in her gaze. "You mean that, don't you?" He nodded. "I do." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. A few months ago, they had been preparing for a permanent goodbye, each convinced they were too far gone to find their way back to each other. And yet, here they were, bound together by something far greater than the past. "I know things aren't magically fixed," Andrew said, his voice quieter now. "And I know I still have to prove myself. But Emily, I want to do this right. Not just for Sophie, but for us." Emily looked down at the sleeping baby, gently adjusting the blanket around her tiny form. "I don't have all the answers," she admitted. "I don't know what this means for us, or where we go from here." Andrew reached over, taking her hand in his. "Then let's figure it out. One day at a time." She searched his face for a long moment, then nodded, squeezing his hand in return. "Okay. A new beginning. Not perfect, not certain, but real." And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Life has a way of pulling us in directions we never expected. Andrew Carter's journey is a reminder that success in business means little if we fail to nurture the relationships that truly matter. Too often, we prioritize ambition, thinking that providing financially is enough, only to realize, sometimes too late, that love requires presence, not just provision. His story teaches us that redemption is always possible, no matter how far we have drifted. Change does not happen overnight. It is built through small, intentional efforts, listening more, showing up, and choosing kindness even when it's difficult. Relationships, especially those tested by time and hardship, require patience and commitment to rebuild. It is never too late to mend broken bonds, to say the words left unspoken, or to embrace a new chapter with an open heart. Whether with a spouse, a child, or an old friend, the opportunity to reconnect and heal is always within reach. In the end, the greatest legacy we leave behind is not our wealth, but the love we have shared and the lives we have touched.